Well, on the eve of World Malaria Day, we're going to be now talking about a breakthrough. A trial of the world's first malaria vaccine will target children up to 2 years of age in Malawi, with other African countries introducing the vaccine in the coming weeks. Nearly half the world's population is at risk from malaria, and sub-Saharan Africa continues to carry a high share of the global burden. Children are particularly vulnerable, with more than 250,000 dying every year from the disease. Well, Professor James Beeson, the head of the Malaria Immunity and Vaccines Laboratory at the Burnet Institution, joins us now from Melbourne to delve a little deeper into this story. Thank you very much for being here with us, James. 3 decades in the making and almost $1 billion in investment later, and might I add, a personal effort on your part out of a lab in Melbourne. What does this vaccine pilot program hope to achieve in places like Malawi? And tell us a bit more about how it works as well.
Yeah, well, this is a really important milestone because we don't have a vaccine at the moment that we can roll out across populations affected by malaria, particularly targeting children. As you mentioned in the intro, malaria mainly affects young children, and most of the burden is in African countries, and around half the world's population is at risk. So we really urgently need a vaccine that can be used for mass vaccination programs in populations to really hammer down malaria and ultimately eliminate malaria from as many countries as possible. So where we're at today is that in the recent decades, the last, since the 80s really, there's been a vaccine in development. It's successfully gone through different clinical studies to show that it does have some protective effect. And then it completed a very large clinical studies in thousands of African children. And the outcome of those big studies showed that the vaccine has about a 40% protective effect. So it's not as good as we'd like, but it's certainly, it is a significant protective effect. So the global goal that had been set for vaccines, for malaria vaccine, is to have a vaccine that's more like about 75% protection. So that gives you a sense of where the vaccine is at. It's not as high as we'd like, but it's certainly significant milestones. So then the next step is where this vaccine is at the moment, and with plans to conduct these very large studies involving hundreds of thousands of children in 3 African countries, really to ask a couple of key questions, and that's really about how would the vaccine be rolled out, and if it's rolled out as part of the childhood immunisation program, how good is it, and is it going to offer the sort of impact on malaria that we'd like to see. And another aspect is that in a way it's a final step to understand the safety of the vaccine and really just make sure this is a vaccine that's safe, that's going to work, and that's going to be acceptable and able to be rolled out in large, in a mass way for childhood immunisation.
On that point, James, this is, a world first, a malaria vaccine, as you've mentioned, to provide partial protection against malaria in young children. Are there any risks associated with this vaccine?
Well, all vaccines, before they get to this sort of large-scale trial, undergo a lot of studies to look at their safety. And when you're giving vaccines to children or giving vaccines to large numbers of people, these things have to be very safe. So the vaccine has gone through, testing in thousands of people already, and shown to be safe and shown to generate an immune response. That's what we're aiming for with the vaccine, generate an immune response that will block the malaria infection. So I think it's fair to say that all indicators are so far that the vaccine is safe, and this is really part of that final process by looking at implementing the vaccine in this large-scale studies of hundreds of thousands of kids, all of whom are going to be monitored, and the safety of the vaccine is part of that evaluation.
And can you talk to us about the role that you played in Melbourne? How did you contribute to the development of this rollout?
Yeah, well, this vaccine is something, as I mentioned, that's been in development for many years, really starting in the 1980s. So there are various groups in Melbourne and Australia working on malaria vaccines, but we haven't had direct involvement in developing this vaccine, which has been led by a public-private partnership, really. So we've done some work evaluating the type of immune response that the vaccine generates, trying to understand how does the vaccine work. As I mentioned, the vaccine has about a 40% protective effect, and it's not as high as we'd like it to be. It's an important first step. So we don't actually know really how the vaccine works. How does it actually stop malaria infection? How does it protect people? If we knew that and we had a much better understanding of that, then we could work out how to generate a much more effective vaccine. And that's a lot of the work that we're doing ourselves at my institute, and other groups around Australia and internationally are working on that question. So maybe I could just briefly say, well, what does a vaccine actually do? So basically what we do with any vaccine, whatever infection it targets, is usually say take a protein or a part of that infectious organism, in this case malaria, and you sort of mix it up in a way that when it's given as an injection with a needle, it stimulates the immune system so that the immune system will then recognise the infection. So that you have the vaccine, then you get exposed to malaria, and your immune system sort of has a moment of, aha, right, I've seen this before, and it mounts an immune response and combats the infection. So how do we make the vaccine better? Well, we can change what we put in the vaccine, we can change the types of proteins, we can attack different parts of the malaria organism to get a better protective effect. Or we could change the vaccine so that we get a different response out of the immune system that is more effective, that really hammers the malaria infection much more effectively and efficiently. So there's some of the things that many of us here in Australia and internationally are working on. At the moment, this vaccine is a really important first step, but we see this really as the first generation, and we need to work towards a next generation vaccine that will be even more protective.
Professor, as you said, a very important first step ahead of what I hope will be many breakthroughs to come on this journey to fighting a disease that has at one time been quite contained, and now we're seeing somewhat of a resurgence. Thank you very much, Professor James Beeson, Head of Malaria Immunity Vaccination Laboratory in Melbourne. Thank you very much for your time.
Okay, thanks.